Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of Rome, right? And so we just left off in class talking about this thing called the struggle of the orders, right? We're talking about racial societal standings and stuff like that, right? Talking about the patricians and the plebeians and how early on in the structure of Rome, basically the only people that could do anything were the patricians, even though the plebeians did everything, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is that we also talked about the struggle of the orders, right? We talked about how the plebes are going to end up actually going on strike so they can actually reform the Roman government and begin to change it over time to actually bring back around more of an equality sense in the Roman Republic, right? And get this group of people added to the Roman government, right? And we talked specifically about the tribunes, right? Now, we got cut off by the bell, okay, I think in both of our classes and stuff like that. And the thing that we need to understand more than anything else is the tribunes are a very important addition to the Roman government, right? They're a council of plebes, right? There are 10 of them, and they were given the power of the veto, right? Now, the veto is something that still exists, of course, in the modern day government that we use in the United States of America. And the big thing about it is what it means, right? In Latin, it means to send back, right? Don't forget that. In Latin, it means to send back, right? And so not to get rid of, not to squash, not to crush, not to eliminate, but to send back and have it actually be fixed or redone, right? And they had the ability to veto laws that were coming out of the Senate that may negatively impact the plebs, right? So the big thing about it, though, going into it is because of all these different reforms, because of the struggle of the orders, right? Patricians and plebs are going to be allowed to get married. The 12 tables are going to be posted in the forum. And several other different major reforms are going to happen during this continuous thing where the plebs would just go on strike, right? Now, the thing that we need to understand, though, is going to begin to blur the lines between patrician and pleb, bring around a little bit more of a fair, simplistic government, but it is also going to set us up for an idea of the rise of a certain leader, right? And we'll talk about that and how basically the patricians and the plebs are going to end up always struggling with one another, and basically when the plebs start picking singular rulers that they like a lot, it's going to shake this whole government up in a big, big way, right? So we'll come back to that in a little bit, though, because we have to talk about something else for a hot second, and we have to jump over to Roman conquest, right? We're now going to talk a little bit more about the idea of Roman conquest, right? And how the Romans are going to go from actually owning just a little bit of land, right? From actually owning just this small amount of Italy to controlling an area this large, right? Which actually didn't happen until like much later in their civilization period, right? Now, the Roman model for conquest, though, during the Republic period, right? So all the stuff that we're about to talk about right now happened during the Roman era of the Republic, was basically this, right? Divide, explore, conquer, right? Using the legion system that would be adopted following the sacking of the Gauls in 399 BC, or excuse me, following Rome being sacked by the Gauls in 399 BC, the legion system would then be acquired, right? And that legion system, of course, is a more organized military that can be divided and sent out, right? So the Romans did not plan, something that we need to understand, did not plan to grow as large as they eventually did, right? They didn't plan to get as big as that red empire map that you saw at the height of it and the extent at 117 AD, right? Romans never intended to do that. They just kept taking over area after area to add to the empire, and things just kind of kept getting bigger and bigger. But by 200, closer to like 299 BC, right around 250 BC, they actually controlled all of Italy, right? The Italian peninsula was completely under the control of the Romans. They had actually even gone through a war with these other different tribes in Italy who fought a war against them because they wanted to be in the Roman Empire, and the Romans were like, we don't know if we want you or not. And the people were like, take us! And so like the big thing about it, though, is what ends up happening, though, is their first international war, their first war with non-Italians, is going to be against a very large city-state right across the Mediterranean, right? And the wars that they end up having with this city-state, that creates a very intense rivalry that will go on for generations, and basically their version of the Punic, or the Persian Wars, is known as the Punic Wars, and it was against the city-state of Carthage, right? Now, something that we need to understand about the Punic Wars is that they're extremely important to the progression of Roman history and Roman historiography, right? When we're talking about the landscape that is Roman history, you gotta know about the Punic Wars, right? The Punic Wars kind of serve as a massive turning point in Roman civilization when they stop focusing just on the Italian peninsula and they start focusing on a more global scale, right? So going into it, though, you have to understand by about 272 BC, all of the Italian peninsula was under the control of the Romans, right? And by that point, a rivalry had actually grown between them and another city-state that's right across the Mediterranean, known as Carthage, right? And now, as you can see right here, Carthage spans the northern area of Africa in modern-day Tunisia Corsica is where they're actually founded, but also they expanded over areas of modern-day Morocco, Algeria, Libya, areas like that, and even all the way into southern Spain, right? Now, they also controlled a very, very large chunk of that little island right there off the coast of Italy as well, known as Sicily, and we'll get to that here in about 2 seconds, right? The thing about that you need to understand something about Carthage, though, is they were a very, very sophisticated society, originally founded by these people known as the Phoenicians, right? And the Phoenicians were actually a trade-based civilization from the ancient empires that never really had a home, necessarily, right? The Phoenicians actually jumped around all over the place, and they created a very large trade network, and they actually originally founded the city of Carthage that would grow to look something like this, which looks like something that would actually probably rival the city of Rome, right? Something very, very sophisticated, very articulate, very trade-based, very eclectic, very much also boasting products from all over the Mediterranean. So in the essence, when we're looking at this is going to be a big turning point because this whole unit could be massively different if Carthage had won. But they didn't. They ended up losing to Rome. Spoiler alert. So going into it to show you understand is you have to understand that we could be talking about a unit about Carthage, right? And how they affected the ancient world. But instead we're talking about Rome because they will be the victors of this thing. And the reason why they ended up getting into a massive rivalry with Carthage, a lot of it had to do with trade, right? Now, a lot of it had to do with trade and also particularly the island of Sicily, right? Because remember, Italy didn't have a lot of natural harbors, right? And the only place that really had them was on the Isle of Sicily, right? But the Romans couldn't actually colonize or I need to stop getting ahead of myself. My words are getting jumbled. The Romans could not go there and start settlements, right? They couldn't go to Sicily and start settlements because the Greeks were already there, right? That little area of green right here, actually, that says Syracuse right there, that was originally a colony of the Greeks, right? And so the thing that you need to understand, though, is that if the Romans wanted to get into the Mediterranean sea trade, they needed to figure out a way to acquire that island, to get Sicily into their own hands, right? And so that will be the thing that actually starts the very first Punic War. The first Punic War starts over the island of Sicily, right? Because basically Rome is going to ally with that small city-state known as Syracuse, and it's going to take Sicily from Carthaginian control, right? The thing that you need to understand, though, is that they almost lost, right? They almost lost, though. A really big, long-winded cause of the entire thing has to do with some pesky pirates and some changing allegiances and stuff like that, but we don't need to get into all that stuff right now. But what we basically need to understand is that Rome chose to ally with the small city-state of Syracuse to come in as their savior and to fight the Carthaginians in their name. But the problem is that just like when the Greeks fought the Persians, the Romans didn't have a super sophisticated navy at the very, very beginning, but at the end of it, they will, right? Because acquiring a navy is the only way you're going to fight the Carthaginians, right? Because the Carthaginians had a large navy. They are very well known for trade, and they were very hard to beat in the water, right? Well, the thing about it is that the Romans had to build a navy to eventually fight the Carthaginians and win. But the thing about it, though, that's very interesting is, like I said, they almost lost until they built a very large fleet of these bad boys, right? What are those things, class? Triremes. I heard every single one of y'all say it, right? I heard literally Emma Pillow in the back going, I heard Addison Bro going, it's a trireme. Yeah, that is a trireme, right? You've seen that design of a vessel before, okay? Well, the reason why you've seen it is because the Phoenicians were the original ones to create them. The Athenians will copy them, right? The Carthaginians copied them as well. Now, interesting little fact of the matter, though, is that there's an old Roman story that actually says how the Romans figured out how to make these boats, right? Now, it's something that you need to understand about Romans and Roman historiography and the way that they actually recorded history is that the Romans record history a lot like the way that Greeks use myths to record history, right? Now, a Greek would have said, and then Poseidon rised up out of the sea and handed one of these boats to the Greeks, right? And they would give a lot of onus to a god, probably, right? Now, whereas the Romans like to fancy up history a lot, right? More than anything else, what probably ended up happening is the Romans probably bought one of these vessels or a handful of them from another empire, maybe Athens, maybe somebody else, right? And would have actually used them and then reverse engineered them and made them and created these different vessels, right? But the story goes is that the Romans actually dove down to the bottom of the Mediterranean without any sophisticated breathing apparatus, found some old sunken ones of the Carthaginians, and then pulled them up to the surface, and then analyzed them and reverse engineered how to make them, right? You gotta love Roman exaggeration, okay? But the big thing that ends up happening is Rome builds a fleet of these bad boys and ends up actually beating Carthage in the very, very first war, right? And what ends up going down, though, when we actually look at this map right over here, you actually can see that they acquired the island of Sicily as well as Corsica and Sardinia, and they also end up actually basically making Carthage own up to the loss, right? And they also begin to put a large amount of debt on the Carthaginians, right? Something that you need to understand when it comes to war in general, war is very, very important, and who ends up having to pay a lot of money at the very end of a war is very important as well. Oh, you're staying? Oh, okay, you're going to stay quiet? All right, so sorry about that. We got some guests that are coming into the house right now that are fresh out of TJ Maxx. Isn't that right, sweetheart?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, so now the big thing about it, though, that you have to understand is that when you lose a very large-scale war, like one like this in the ancient empires, right, someone is going to have to end up taking ownership of debt, right? And so Carthage is actually going to owe a lot of money to Rome after the end of the very first Punic War. And so the thing about it is that the Carthaginians are scrambling to actually pay this debt. Now, interestingly enough as well, Carthage didn't have an army. They actually usually hired mercenary armies and stuff like that, but we're not going to get into all that stuff because it's really not that important to you, a high school student who's learning about this. The thing that's more important to you is understanding the major players that are now about to pop up, right? Due to this debt that is being forced on the Carthaginians, it's going to anger a Carthaginian general so much that it's basically going to create a rivalry between Rome and Carthage that would end in the destruction of Carthage, right? Not a chill rivalry, not a relaxed one. A rivalry much like Chappelle and Mount Carmel, right? An intense one, a vicious one, right? Now, the thing about it that you need to understand is the general that actually popped up during this time period is a man by the name of Hamilcar, right? Hamilcar is a Carthaginian general that was furious at Rome by this point and disgusted with the fact that they were being forced to pay back these reparations, right? And so Hamilcar is going to actually, of course, have to go off and find this money eventually, but before we get there, you have to understand that he also had a son, right? His son's name was Hannibal, right? Now, Hannibal is the guy that gets most of the credit in all of these stories about the Punic Wars because he was a very, very intense general, very, very smart, very brilliant, and also he's very well known for marching over the Alps at one point. The big thing that you need to understand about this entire idea, though, is that Hamilcar apparently hated Rome so much that he made his young son Hannibal swear on the body of a dead goat that he would forever hate Rome and destroy them one day, right? And so Hannibal, from a very young age, was raised to despise Rome. Now, notice these coins right here, though, with Hamilcar's face on them. They're very, very important because of where he had to go, all right? So Hamilcar, to help pay off Rome, he had to go into Spain and find some new silver mines, right? So he could continue to pay Rome for the reparations of the war. But what's going to end up happening is, like, decades later, after the First Punic War, Hannibal goes with him and stuff like that, but what ends up going down is Rome feels threatened, right? So Hamilcar went to Spain to acquire new silver mines to pay Rome back. Well, Rome didn't like the fact that they were getting very close, right? And Rome basically said, hey, Hamilcar, you cross that river right there, it's going to start another whole war. And Hamilcar says, okay, you want to play that game? And so he crossed that river anyway, right? Starting another very, very large war. That Hamilcar and Hannibal, by the way, by this point, was a young general and stuff like that, and a very good upstart, and a very Alexander the Great type figure, right? So the thing about it, though, is that the Carthaginians thought they were going to win this one, right? They thought for sure they were going to win because of the army that they had, right? And so what ended up happening is Rome felt threatened, decided to attack the Carthaginians, a second Punic War starts, and Hannibal and his army decides that they are done playing around. And that, yes, is Rome going to be borderline impossible to attack from the coast? Yes, because of their rocky cliff shoreline areas that make it almost impossible to invade them from there. So he decides he's going to go through the mountains, right? Hannibal decides that to impress his father, right, Hamilcar, right, that he's going to lead a massive army over the Alps, right? And some of his military was even riding elephants, right? Like, they had literally 30-something elephants that were going to march across the Alps. Now, granted, that not that many made it across. like elephants don't do too well when they're walking over the Alps and stuff like that. But this moment is such a big deal that it's even actually referenced in The Simpsons during one of the episodes, which is super funny.
Surely there's no harm in laying in the middle of a public street.
Not the elephants!
I know, it's crazy. crazy, right? Sideshow Bob gets crushed by a bunch of elephants. Now, look, going into it, though, you have to understand that Hannibal actually marched this massive military over the Alps, right? Many of the elephants actually slipped off the mountains and died, which is super funny to me. Don't ask me why, because I feel like it probably took a really long time. It was super slow. But, like, the other thing about it, though, as well, is that a handful of elephants actually made the journey over, right? Only about, like, a double, like, right around 10 of them actually made it over. One of them being Hannibal's elephant by the name of Sura. She was a female elephant that actually saw him through most of this entire war and stuff like that. But they decided that they wanted to try and march directly on Rome. Now, Romans are not used to this, right? Romans are not used to this at all because they feel as though the geography of the Italian peninsula protects them from direct attack, right? The thing about it, though, that also on top of all that is that the Carthaginians, when they did get into Italy, they tried to attack Rome directly. It didn't work out that well because Rome's surrounded by a swamp. They couldn't get to him. Hannibal ended up getting an infection in his eye, and he ended up losing it and stuff like that. Not like losing it, like misplaced it. They had to cut it out. But the thing that you have to understand, though, is that, write this down real quick, is the Carthaginians originally were whooping the tar out of the Romans, okay? They literally invaded Italy. When I talk about this whole thing, when most people hear about the Punic Wars and when Hannibal invaded, like, Rome or whatever, if you went up to Mr. Wooderson or Mr. Mathern and asked them, how long do you think Hannibal was in Italy invading Rome? They might say, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. Turns out he was there for 16 years, destroying a large number of Roman military officials, right? One of them actually had this battle known as the Battle of, not the Battle of Zama. So, like, now, what's the name? No. Crap! Like, I can't remember the name of this battle, but it doesn't matter. But apparently, like, Hannibal's troops were so good at destroying Roman armies that they took a bunch of prisoners one time because their arms got tired from stabbing people to death, right? But the thing that ended up happening, though, is Rome almost lost yet again in the Second Punic War due to the invasions of Hannibal, right? But then a Roman general shows up that has a stroke of genius, right? And his name is Scipio Africanus, right? And the general, Scipio Africanus, realizes something in the 16th year of Hannibal invading Italy, right? Of Hannibal and his armies destroying Roman military officials, of them burning down farms and trying to cause really, really large mass destruction. Remember that, what I just said, burning down farms and causing mass destruction and stuff like that. Scipio Africanus, though, shows up out of nowhere. He comes up with an idea, right? And he says to himself, wait a minute, Carthage doesn't have a military of its own. They hire people like Hannibal and Hamilcar to go off on invasions and stuff like that. So who right now is protecting Carthage? Turns out, no one, right? So Carthage, okay, which was now controlled Spain, and Hannibal was wreaking havoc in Italy, this general by the name of Scipio Africanus is going to decide to assemble several legions and take the fight straight to Carthage and try to attack northern Africa and destroy them directly, right? And so now this is an interesting strategy because what it's going to do is it's going to force Hannibal to actually take his armies out of Italy and return to Carthage, right? Now, the thing that ends up actually happening, though, is he decides first to attack Spain, where Hamilcar is, right? And try to basically de-Carthagify it, right? He wages several large-scale battles in Spain, actually wins all of them, and also Hamilcar in this actually, some of the earliest battles in Spain ends up dying, right? And so it ends up actually being vanquished by Scipio's forces. And what ends up happening though, is that Hannibal wouldn't budge until he actually turned his sights on the city of Carthage itself, right? And so Scipio begins to march directly onto Carthage, which forces Hannibal to take his forces out of Italy and return to Africa to defend Carthage, right? Which is an absolutely genius moment in history. Carthage then is going to end up actually losing at this battle called the Battle of Zama, where the Romans actually destroy his forces, and Carthage ends up actually giving up and surrendering in 202 BC and loses yet again the Second Punic War. And Hannibal actually has to flee and find another job in another kingdom because he's very embarrassed and stuff like that because he actually just lost this job. The last that history ever heard of Hannibal is that he was basically a mercenary general out towards Turkey, and one of his last military strategies to actually win a naval fight was to throw big pots of snakes at the other group, which is absolutely hilarious. So now going into it, though, that you have to understand is that Hannibal ends up losing his job, and then a third Punic War starts up in 146 BC, and Carthage would actually be left in ruins. Something that you have to understand, though, is that Carthage didn't even need, nor want, nor ask for this third Punic War. Basically, Rome was just really, really upset. So Rome was really upset, and the rivalry had gotten so bad that like several Roman senators just wanted to see Carthage destroyed. Actually, one of the very famous Roman senators, hey, you leave your sister alone. So one of the very famous Roman senators, by a man by the name of Cato the Elder, would finish all of his big speeches after the Second Punic War. It could be about anything. Like, he could be talking about, like, what's for hot lunch on Tuesday, but then literally he would finish every single one of them like this. He would be like, and by the way, Carthage was to be destroyed. And he would just, like, then go sit down. So, like, literally what ended up happening is for over a decade, like, closer to actually 60 years, the Romans just hated the Carthaginians and just wanted to see them destroyed. And so, literally what ended up happening is a third Punic War happened where the grandson of Scipio Africanus actually walked down to Carthage and destroyed it, and actually sold a lot of their people into slavery and left Carthage in ruins. And now, apparently, the way the story goes is that that war was actually started because literally the Romans had like a little square of Carthaginian land and stuff like that, and they stabbed it with a spear, which is hilarious. But something that you have to understand about Roman culture is this little bit of land is actually something very, very funny. And again, another moment where Romans tend to exaggerate stuff. Yes, the Romans did leave Carthage in ruins, right? And the story goes is that the Romans then proceeded to salt all of the land in Carthage, right? Literally to pour salt and dump it all over it so that you could never grow anything there ever again. Now, in reality, they probably didn't do that because an ancient empire salting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hectares of land would be borderline impossible. More than likely, that same square they stabbed with a piece of, like, would stab with a spear to declare war, they probably just salted that, right? Like, so, like, now, but going into it, though, after the Carthaginians end up losing the Third Punic War and it ends up being in ruins, Greece, Macedonia, and parts of Southwest Asia even come under the control of Romans, using the fact of diplomacy and threats during the Punic Wars and several other battles. But during this point, basically, the Punic Wars served as a turning point when the Romans set their sights way beyond Italy, and they start taking over places like Greece, Macedonia, Southwest Asia. There are some different tribes that end up giving them a lot of trouble and stuff like that later on, like the Parthians and stuff like that. We'll talk about them a little bit later on. They were led by this guy named King Mithridates III at one point. He was known as the Poison King. We'll discuss him a little bit later on, too. The Roman Republic, though, would eventually be divided into provinces, and a governor would be used to rule and appoint each one, and the people of the new provinces had to pay taxes, and a lot of them were taken into slavery, right? So something that we need to keep in the back of our minds right now is there is a massive influx of slaves being brought into the empire from these conquered territories, right? And Carthage and Carthaginian slaves are going to be a very, very large group of them as well. But what we're going to do, though, is we're going to stop the flip right here, and we're going to pick up in class, and we're going to talk more about the fallout of these wars and how it's actually going to lead to the rise of some new political parties and how the plebs are going to stop just going on strike, and instead they're going to start electing officials that are going to start really, really kind of rocking the boat in the government of Rome, right? But we'll talk about that a little bit later on. I'll see y'all in class. Y'all have a good one.